When I think about what we should be teaching, and we'll get onto the actual individual registrar's learning needs in a second, again, we can think of three broad areas. This is such an important aspect, I think, of our role as supervisors. It may sound basic, but I think just re-emphasising it now is so important, that registrars are driven by clinical knowledge. And despite the fact that both ACREM and RSCGP exams are very much applied knowledge, interrogation of reasoning, that very broad integration of knowledge, registrars, understandably, they see the exams as being knowledge-based and they want to acquire knowledge. Probably way too reductionist to say this, but we could actually say we don't need to teach registrars any knowledge. They can look all that stuff up and they're actually very good at it. Clearly, we can help point them to resources. We can reinforce some of that stuff. But what our job is and what our strengths are is to teach them the wisdom, the art of general practice, and that is skills and attitudes. In a kind of reflective way, in your role as supervisors, I'd really encourage you, when you're thinking about what should I be teaching my registrar, it's not the dose of minocycline for an adolescent with acne, clearly, although, that will come up, but it's really the communication skills with that shy, embarrassed teenager, or the consultation skills to actually invite a conversation with them because they came about something else, or the clinical reasoning skills that may flow from that when there's other issues at hand, or the attitudes around a whole range of aspects of practice. So again, that may sound basic, but I think it's such an important aspect of what we can do as supervisors, moving away from the clinical knowledge and moving much more into the domain of skill and attitudinal-based teaching. And I don't want to get too far into the theory, into the academia, but this is kind of interesting, mostly because the Johari window, which is born out of the psychological sphere as a kind of appraisal of what people know about themselves and what other people see in an individual, it's been applied to the teaching and learning domain and around learning needs. The Johari window was devised by two psychologists, one called Joe and one called Hari. And you probably know those areas: open, blind, hidden, and unknown areas. But you probably know them much more as these areas of, the known knowns, the unknown knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. And you may even know Donald Rumsfeld, the Defense Secretary for the US 20 years ago or so, stumbling his way through this in relation to the war in Iraq, a very famous YouTube clip based on that. But we're here in Australian general practice, not in US foreign policy, and talking about these areas. And this is something that another ME, Ed Polynes, and myself conceived when we talked about this a couple of years ago. And I kind of like this. It's a bit more tangible for me, that the knowns we can see. It's the bit of the iceberg that floats above the surface, but there's all these unknowns that the Titanic could run into. And in fact, we want to run into the unknowns. We want to uncover those. We want to shine a light on those unknowns. And so when we think about this, we're thinking about, well, I've got my registrar. They're going to be driven by two things. They're going to be driven by their wants. We have to support their needs. So they will very much identify their known knowns, and they'll learn stuff about what they like. So a registrar that was an ex-physio comes into the practice, they relish the musculoskeletal stuff, and they'll learn more and more about it. And we all do that. That's what CPD is about. We all go off to things that we like and to reinforce our knowledge, and possibly even query the presenter and say, oh, I don't know if you're right there. I hope there's a few of you nodding. Yeah, I know what that means. We also are driven, and registrars want to learn about the known unknown. They're the things that they know they don't know. And that is uncomfortable. I know I don't know this area. Maybe I don't see a whole lot of women's health, so I can kind of ignore it. But I'm seeing a lot of kids, and I know I'm not very good at this, and I have to learn. So they're driven by clinical queries, they're driven by patient encounters, they're driven by things that are interesting, and they've got an exam. So they're aware of the things they don't know, so they're trying to brush up. Most of these things are clinical. So we can help them diagnose this rash. We can help them identify that this is a herald patch, a pityriasis rosea, and a Christmas tree rash distribution, that we can sit and wait, and this will go away in 6 to 8 weeks. We can support them in that, but they can really read a whole lot around that themselves. What we can do, what do they need to learn, is all these other aspects of practice, as I was saying. And I apologize, this is RACGP centric, but ACRM have a very similar model around all the domains of practice that are important, including rural practice, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. And they're the areas that I would strongly encourage. As soon as we're talking clinical, we've got time, we've got scope to take the teaching beyond the clinical. Let's move to clinical reasoning. Let's think about how the registrar thinks and unpack their reasoning. Let's think about not just the very core clinical elements of data gathering, say what the history taken was like, or their examination, or how they interpreted investigations, but how they synthesize those, how they put them together, how they weight one thing over another, how they seek confirmatory or data that will refute the differential. So that's where our money is. That's what we can really do. So we can talk about consultation skills. We can talk about how to drive this mechanism that basically is our bread and butter. We will see hundreds of thousands of patients in our careers if we have a long and busy general practice career. And we need registrars to come out of GP training knowing how to run and navigate a consultation. We need them to have organisational skills. We need them to be able to manage uncertainty. We certainly have a guide to managing uncertainty. I've talked about communication skills, patient-centred care, incorporating the patient's agenda and genuinely involving them in patient management. Professionalism, how we can truly embrace professionalism as it exists in this very unique environment of general practice, and how they can be reflective practitioners. So all these things, I guess it's a long and possibly daunting list, but I think when we think about teaching and learning, it's not about reinforcing what they can get from ETG. It's really pushing them to these other areas. That's our absolute strength as supervisors and educators. So you've got this disparate group of registrars coming into the practice. Clearly, they will all have had different exposure in the hospital settings. They've got different needs. How do you, in a formal or informal way, identify their learning needs? Let's talk about some that GPSA have put into their learning needs guide. So we talked about past experience, and that's not just past experience. How many hospital terms have you done and what were they in? And my goodness, you've never seen a women's health patient in your hospital training, managed to avoid them all through your ED time, but also past teaching and learning experience, origin of the registrar, what type of a medical system did they train in and work in, what influences they've had on their learning. If you look at our IMG guide, we elaborate on that, and there's a really, really rich area to think about how registrars have the culture in which they were taught to teach and learn. Self-assessment, there are confidence self-assessment grids, a sort of checklist scenario, which I like, and the call for help list we've talked about. Obviously, all the formative assessment tools that we can use, direct observation, case discussion, etc. Certainly at GP Synergy, which has now been closed effectively, and now through the RACGP, there is a pre-GP GPT-1 assessment done of registrars' knowledge-based quiz, and that can help identify learning needs. So there's a whole range of things, but what I would like to do is to point you to this tool, the 4R framework that GPSA have developed, because it's a really nice tool to kind of think broadly about learning needs for your registrar, and also that focus not just on PCOS as a clinical area as a gap, but more those skills and attitude and those broad learning areas. So when we think of a GP registrar, or think of yourselves as a GP, we interface with 4 broad domains, and they all happily start with the letter R. So it turns it into the 4R framework. I guess perhaps the first interaction we have is with the patient, and that's a relationship. And obviously, in saying relationship, you're thinking about communication and rapport and connection and longitudinal care and continuity and all those sorts of aspects. So there's that area of practice that the registrar needs to be able to develop and build upon and nurture a relationship with the patient. The second one is they have to interact with the problem. And you might say, well, isn't that the patient? Well, no, because the problems change with every patient encounter or can do. And this is the art of reasoning. So again, we've talked about reasoning, and I'm very, very passionate about the role that we as supervisors and educators play in terms of teaching registrars around reasoning. And they're the sorts of things I talked about. Again, data gathering, data synthesis, integration, weighting, communication, incorporation of evidence. The third area the registrar interacts with is the system, the wide world, other healthcare providers, Medicare, the PBS, work cover, all those aspects of the system out there. And that's this sort of organisational and medico-legal aspects of practice. And the last R is reflection. And that's that we interact, the registrars interact with themselves. And so how effective are they as a reflective learner? And so that just gives a schema that's sort of well beyond those very specific learning needs to do with the clinical, much, much more broadly. And you might think, well, that's a nice framework. How do I use that? Well, we can use this. Please download that. You may reject it out of hand and say, you know, this doesn't help me or help my registrars. But there are two versions of this. There's a self-assessment tool for registrars to complete, and there's one for supervisors to review. And it takes you through those four broad domains and hopefully will help uncover some of those aspects of practice, those broad areas that registrars may not know, they don't know, but are such critical areas of learning need for that individual. And please, can I point you to our Helping a Registrar Plan Their Learning in General Practice Guide, which is, again, a very practical resource for covering this area. You've got a pluripotential, you've got this stem cell of a registrar. You don't know what their past influences have been, their past exposures been, their learning needs. You have to help them uncover those areas. That's part of our job, and support their learning in those aspects so they come out as a well-rounded GP. Shouldn't their learning needs record follow them through training? Well, I think certainly the RACGP, I think not ACRM, still do not require a formal learning plan. I think that is not the case with ACRM. I think that is required. But one of my really, really big messages to registrars is capturing the learning needs. I don't care how, sticky notes, exercise book, notes on their phone, some way of saying, I saw that patient and I need to learn more about it. And again, not just because they didn't know how to manage their psoriasis, but because they stumbled around and thought their communication skills may have been better, or that you observed them and their consultation structure was sketchy. So I don't really mind. And in fact, there's some evidence around learning logs, learning plans, written documents not being that useful, and in fact, sometimes being a barrier. But I mean, no, I do not push learning plans with registrars, but I absolutely push as hard as I can, capturing learning needs in order to be able to review them.